The Lich King versus Rexa.
I'm acting on instinct.
Well, Nvidia have done it once again. They released yet another GeForce 50 series GPU without any reviews. This time they announced the GeForce RTX 5050. They said it would be available on July 1st, and that was it really. There were no early reviews. There are even no reviews on July 1st. Instead, consumers would have to go in blind. But you know what you don't have to go in blind to? Today's sponsor. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Ugreen and their NAS Sync DXP 4800 Plus, designed to be as user-friendly as possible. The NAS Sync DXP 4800 Plus addresses the issue of high-cost, limited storage cloud services by storing and backing up all of your data locally. The 4-bay model offers a maximum 112TB capacity with excellent third-party hard drive and SSD support. Transfer speeds of up to 1,250 megabytes per second are possible, which is the equivalent of 1 terabyte about every 20 minutes, while the U7 Intel 12th Gen Core i5 processor allows for effortless multitasking. As I said, this is a beginner-friendly NAS, and part of that is a simple step-by-step guide which will get even the most novice users up to speed quickly. And on top of that, there's app-friendly support for Windows, iOS, Android, and smart TVs. With a Ugreen NAS, you can also effortlessly classify photo albums, and the NAS Sync has a built-in AI smart recognition and classification function that allows you to search photos by simply entering search keywords such as pets, fruits, vehicles, and loads more. So if you'd like to learn more about Ugreen's latest NAS and their Amazon Prime Day deals, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so the first time Nvidia did this with a GeForce 50 series product was with the RTX 5060 Ti 8GB. The 16GB model, apparently that was fine. Nvidia was okay with you seeing benchmarks for that model, but the 8GB version, no sir, you just had to assume that it worked the same way. And the play there was to block partners such as MSI and ASUS from sending out 8GB cards to reviewers. And even the retail availability, that was delayed for a few days, allowing the 16GB reviews to permeate the internet. The plan worked though, as there was very little 8GB coverage for the 5060 Ti, and what did appear was heavily delayed. Then for the RTX 5060, so the non-Ti model, of which there was only an 8GB version, Nvidia let review samples slip out for that one, but this time opted to block the driver access instead. And that's something that they can much more easily control on their end. And it meant that despite having the hardware in hand, it was practically impossible to use it. Then, for the icing on the cake, they released it during the Computex trade show, when most of the world's tech media, ourselves included, were overseas in Taiwan. So now we have the third 8GB Blackwell GPU, the RTX 5050. And for this one, there was no review samples at all, so not having the driver was a non-issue for this one, and in fact we couldn't even purchase it until several days after it was meant to appear on shelves, so a bit of an odd release, but certainly not the strangest thing Nvidia's ever done. Anyway, the good news is, if you can call it that, I have an RTX 5050, which I paid a little over 500 Australian dollars for, so certainly not the best investment I've ever made, but we did need a review after all. But before we jump into the blue bar graphs, let's quickly go over some of the specs. So the RTX 5050 is set to cost $250 US, making it $50 US cheaper than the RTX 5060. It uses a smaller GB207 die with 16.9 billion transistors in a 149 square millimeter die. So it's 17% cheaper than the RTX 5060, but there are 33% fewer cores. And along with that, Nvidia's also downgraded the GDDR7 memory of the other Blackwell GPUs to GDDR6 for the 5050, reducing the memory bandwidth by almost 30% to 320 gigabytes per second. And this means the 5050 could be considerably slower than the 5060, and to the degree that we'll see it offer much worse value, which will be very disappointing if true. Now, for testing, a lot of the games have been benchmarked using higher quality presets, and this is because the data is used to compare with a wide range of products, all the way from an RTX 5050 right up to the RTX 5090. That said though, while retesting with low or medium quality presets would improve the frame rates, you can expect to find very similar margins between competing products. For example, the RTX 5050, 5060 and 9060 XT 8GB will all scale in a very similar fashion, meaning the overall findings will be much the same. All of that said, if there is enough demand, I will retest a select range of budget GPUs using lower quality presets in a separate content piece. Then there's the CPU, and of course I will be using our standard GPU test system, which has a 9800X3D, because again, we want the data for all GPUs to be comparable, and I will actually produce a video soon where I compare all current and previous generation GPUs. But from a benchmarking perspective, removing the CPU bottleneck makes the most sense, and this test method really only becomes problematic in outlier cases where the CPU overhead is excessive, like what we see in some games with the B580. In the case of the RTX 5050 and 9060 XT though, we would see very similar margins between these two products with a Ryzen 5 7500F for example, and that's because you're almost always going to end up being GPU limited, so just keep that in mind. Anyway, let's move on to the benchmarks to find out what the RTX 5050 has for us. First up, we have Marvel Rivals at 1080p, and here the 5050 was good for 50 FPS. So playable performance, and of course you can lower the quality preset. That did make it 25% faster than the RX 7600, which is a similarly priced previous generation product, and it even managed to match the ARC B580. However, the 8GB 9060 XT was 25% faster, though given it cost 20% more, that's really only a slight advantage for a Radeon GPU in terms of value. So in this particular test, the 5050 looks decent. It's certainly not going to blow anyone away with its performance, even for $250 US, but I'd say it's passable here, or near enough to. Next up we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and again the performance at 1080p is solid, 70 FPS on average, though that's only enough to roughly match the ARC A770, so the older ARC GPU, and the old Radeon RX 6650 XT, so certainly not amazing in that sense. And worse still, this time the 9060 XT 8GB was 41% faster, and that's a massive increase given the difference in price. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, this is another game where the RTX 5050 delivers reasonable performance using the high preset at 1080p. 72 FPS on average is certainly playable, though relative to several other entry-level products it's not particularly great. For example, this makes the 5050 just a few frames faster than the old RTX 3060, while it again matched the 6650 XT and ARC A770. The very disappointing results though are seen when comparing to the 9060 XT 8GB, as here the 5050 gets slaughtered. The Radeon GPU was 54% faster, rendering 111 FPS on average, resulting in a much more impressive experience. Now moving on to Hogwarts Legacy, which has also been tested using the high preset, so the second highest preset, we see that the RTX 5050 is again good for 70 FPS on average, which in this example is the same level of performance seen from the ARC B580 and RTX 4060, along with the 6650 XT. As a result, the 9060 XT 8GB was again massively faster, delivering 50% better performance with an average of 105 FPS, and again it cost just 20% more. So in terms of value, this does spell disaster for the new budget GeForce GPU. For testing The Last of Us Part 1, the Ultra preset is used as most GPUs can deliver over 60 FPS, and we see that that's indeed the case with the 9060 XT 8GB, which ended up almost 40% faster than the RTX 5050. The 5050 came in slightly slower than the RX 7600, but comfortably ahead of the 6650 XT, so not exactly amazing performance, even at $250 US. Now, Star Wars Outlaws enables ray tracing by default, so this is a glimpse of what the RTX 5050 might offer for those interested in RT performance. We're looking at just 34 FPS on average here, which is the same level of performance seen previously from the RX 7600 and ever so slightly better than the ARC A770. It also meant that the 9060 XT 8GB is almost 50% faster in this example, rendering 50 FPS on average. As was the case in Marvel Rivals, the RTX 5050 is somewhat competitive in Space Marine 2. Here the 9060 XT 8GB was 22% faster, so in terms of value they're quite similar, and in the end the 5050 was comparable to the RTX 4060 and 6700 XT, so not too bad I guess. Obviously I'm not expecting the RTX 5050 to do all that well relative to the 9060 XT 8GB in Call of Duty Black Ops 6, given Radeon GPUs typically perform very well in this title. But just 60 FPS on average at 1080p is rather weak performance, and that made it barely faster than the RTX 3060 and RX 6600, and slower than the 6650 XT and ARC B580. Meanwhile, the 9060 XT 8GB was 100% faster. Finally, the last game we're going to look at the individual results for is Clair Obscur Expedition 33, and here the 9060 XT 8GB was 38% faster than the RTX 5050. Meanwhile, the 5050 was comparable to the RTX 4060 and 7600 XT, along with the ARC B580 and RX 7600. Now, as noted earlier, the RTX 5050 features a 130 watt TDP, and therefore requires just a single PCIe power input. For our testing, we're measuring the power draw from both the GPU and CPU, as this accounts for any CPU overhead. The RTX 5050 consumes roughly the same amount of power as the RTX 4060, meaning it uses around 60 watts less than the 9060 XT, so a reasonable saving, though of course it was much slower in our gaming benchmarks. Speaking of which, here's how the RTX 5050 performed on average at 1080p across all 18 games tested. For the average frame rate, we're looking at 66 FPS on average, which disappointingly made it 3% slower than the RX 7600. So in other words, you're getting roughly 7600 performance for 7600 money, though it is upgraded with better quality upscaling, so there is that. The big problem for the RTX 5050 as I see it is the 9060 XT 8GB, which might cost $50 US more, so that's a 20% premium, but the Radeon GPU was a massive 44% faster on average in our testing. Of course, I don't recommend you waste money on any 8GB GPU in 2025 and instead opt for the 16GB version of the 9060 XT, and while that is considerably more expensive than the 5050, presumably you're keeping whatever you buy now for at least the next 4 years, meaning it's a long-term investment, so spending more on something that will actually last seems like the smart play. And as an example of that, if we look at the 1440p data, we see that here the 9060 XT is now 56% faster on average, which is a result of the 9060 XT handling the increased load better, but also the